Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. We still do have a number of people logging in, but because we have a lot of ground to cover today, we're going to get started right away, and hopefully they'll be able to catch up. I'd like to introduce cyber threats facing manufacturing companies and distribution companies. Our webinar for today, this is about cyber risk management. And our panelists today are Steve Racing, President and CEO of ASMGI, and Frank Yako, CIO and Director of Strategic Initiatives for ASMGI. I do want to ask everybody to use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. If you have questions, we'll get to them right away, or by the end of the webinar, and we'll get started right now. So, Steve, why don't you take it away?
Great, thanks, Paul. Thanks to everybody for attending today and sharing your time with us. We are going to talk about cyber threats specific to manufacturing, and it's a huge area of interest from a cyber threat standpoint, and clearly something that we can hopefully make an impact to today. But I'm Steve Racing, President and CEO of ASMGI, as Paul mentioned, and joining me today is Frank Yako. Thanks for being with us today, Frank.
Hey, Steve, thanks for having me. Looking forward to the conversation. Should be great.
Okay, some of the things we're going to talk about today, some introductions and an overview. We won't worry too much about that. Organizational risk, I want to define that and just get level set on kind of a perspective around organizational risk. We're going to talk a little bit about cyber insurance, some of the current cyber risks in manufacturing, and then we'll put forth a risk management model that can be effective in addressing some of these risks. So fair enough. Ready to go? All right, let's jump right in. So I want to ask all of the attendees today to just take a moment to really think about why it is that you're here, and just really address those issues if you can. And as Paul said, feel free to ask questions, and we'll try to address them immediately if it makes sense too. We do have a Q&A section at the end of the proposal or the presentation as well. So organizational risk. So here's, we'll start with a question, Frank, a little pop quiz, right? Organizational risk, can you assess it? Can you assess it and manage organizational risk?
Yeah, absolutely. No one said it's easy, but that's really the key to, we'll talk about this, of lowering your overall organizational risk is to assess it and know what you're dealing with. If you don't assess it and understand what you're dealing with as an organization, then you have no ability to manage and lower your risk. So the answer is definitely yes.
Yep. And this will be important as we define a model in how to address organizational risk. But, I think the first step is to really define what it is. And I think organizational risk could probably be defined as any risk that the organization faces, right? We're going to talk specifically more about cyber than anything else, but why don't you, Frank, go ahead and explain what is organizational risk anyway?
Sure. We define it in a number of different ways, as is highlighted on the slide. First of all, from a business perspective, so anything that could potentially affect your business from a supply chain perspective. There's all types of incidents or examples today with everything going on in the world. Even prior to COVID, but certainly highlighted with COVID, and now with the different events that are going on in the world that could impact your organization from a supply chain perspective. Ultimately, risks can be associated with financial loss as well and impact your organization. Then also from a brand or reputation impact, the risk associated with that, and even the recovery from that can pose a significant risk to your organization. Technology exists in many different facets, but both from an internal solutions or threat perspective, external threats, all the bad actors out there that are constantly trying to look at how to jeopardize an organization's stability. Also, with all the dependencies tying back to both the supply chain as well as integration from a technology standpoint, all those integrations are critical for operating, but also pose a risk depending on how thorough your third-party environment is. And then also tied to that, Service providers are, again, through integrations or even the services that you rely on can pose a threat to your risk or your organization as well. And then last but not least, and again, this kind of all ties back to the external, internal threats as well. Those are occurring every day and pose a significant risk to every organization in today's world, unfortunately.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. I think that's a great overview. And the point that we like to make is that there are influences to risk, right? They can be external, they can be internal, but there are influences or forces that act on this and create more risk or less risk, right? So some of the external things that we see all the time and are constantly changing, regulations and compliance, but business commitments and contractual commitments, they really influence, if you say you're going to do something, right, that really influences, how much risk you assume as a company and stuff. And then there are internal risks that go along with that, or internal influences or forces that influence that risk. And I think it's important to recognize that it isn't a static thing, right? It's a very dynamic thing. And I think, one of the trends that we see in the industry is moving from more of a point in time model to more of a continuous model or an ongoing model. And I think that's critical to understand that it's changing constantly. What do you think?
Yeah, exactly. Any business that's growing or looking to expand, has to balance, what amount of risk they want to assume as they go forward, and all these factors come into play. So it just becomes the proverbial risk reward, balancing act of how to manage the risk while also continuing to grow and expand the business, in all different ways.
Yep. So who owns organizational risk, Frank?
Well, that's one that, specific to cybersecurity. A lot of people think that that's, the security team, but the reality is, overall risk and cybersecurity risk are really owned by the business, or should be owned by the business. There's no way that security by itself can affect the type of change or address the broad spectrum of things that we were just talking about. And that's really, why it's important to have the visibility at the board level or the C-suite to be able to holistically address the type of things we were just describing.
Yep. And I think one of the things that we're seeing more of are, boards and C-suite executive asking really hard questions, right?
Right, exactly.
Of participants in the business. And so this equation's been around forever, but it still really applies. So do you have some thoughts around, how to compose risk or how to quantify it or calculate it?
Well, this all goes back to really understanding, what the different risks are that your organization, faces as just a part of doing business, and then, breaking that down to the likelihood of that happening to your organization, and then, what that impact is. And really, going back to the question of, can you manage risk for your organization? It starts with understanding what those risks are, and then balancing and understanding the likelihood and the impact. And ultimately, I know we have the other points on this slide, but the goal is to reduce ideally the likelihood and the impact that has, so that when all is said and done, you're reducing the risk that your organization is assuming as part of doing business. Yeah. Again, that crosses that whole spectrum of things that organizations have to deal with, including cybersecurity.
Right. I think a key in that statement, Frank, is that a good objective is to lower risk, right? That's but what we recognize as businesses is it is a risk reward equation, right? So the more risk you take, theoretically, the more reward you make. But I think that it's important to understand that risk is just math, right? It's just it's an equation, and the components that make that up are multiplicative, right? So for example, if you're able to drive the likelihood of an event happening to zero, then there's no risk, right? It's gone. You mitigate it right off the table completely. Or if likewise, if you if you are able to drive the impact to zero, then you would take the risk off the table. And that's what I think it's important to understand, that it's just math, right? But treatment of risk, I like this slide because there really are only 4 ways that you can treat risk, right? You can either accept it if the cost to mitigate it is more than the risk itself. Then just accept it, right? It would be silly to spend that money to mitigate the risk. You can avoid the risk, and the metaphor that I like to use in this case is, if the risk is falling off a cliff, don't go near the cliff. And as it equates to business or cyber risk, the way that you avoid certain risks is don't take the chances that would lead to that risk or make it real, right? But again, if you look at the risk reward equation, you don't get the reward if you avoid the risk, you probably avoid the reward as well. So, and then the other option is to transfer the risk, which is basically to put it on cyber insurance or to carry it on your balance sheet, but it's to make the risk somebody else's problem, right? Whether financially or however that case may be. And lastly, but not leastly, is to mitigate it or reduce the risk. And that requires an investment of some sort, right? So the risk isn't going to go away completely, or you're not going to accept it. You're going to reduce it, or you're going to mitigate it, and you make an investment in some technology. So some food for thought. I'm probably going to skip over this, but I think it's worth having people really think about, what is their, the risks that they face, and what is it from a cyber standpoint that they face on an ongoing basis, and those kind of things. Do you have a plan, right? So we're going to talk a little bit more about the incident response plan and those kind of things, but does that exist, and various other things? Do you even know what all the assets are, that you have that are connecting to your business network, or various different things? And so I think it's critical to really understand all those things. Let's talk a little bit about cyber insurance. I want to spend a little bit of time on this, not a lot. We've done webinars. We actually have one coming up in April where we're going to talk specifically about cyber insurance. We'll bring people from the industry, from the cyber insurance industry, to the table. But I think what's important to really understand about cyber insurance is it's not a static either, right? It's changing, right? So the insurance industry doesn't really want to pay out money, right? If you think about a business model, they want to take in money. They want to maximize the amount of money they take in and minimize the amount of money that they take out. So, or that
they want to manage their risk.
They want to manage their risk, right? So they're in fact, this industry a lot of times is referred to as professional risk takers, right? So they want to, theoretically, they should understand the risk. More risk should be a higher premium, less risk should be a lower premium. I honestly don't think they've really taken the time to understand cyber, but now that they're, I'll say, on the losing end from a monetary standpoint, there's a catch up. There's a hurry up phase of really understanding cyber risk, and they're trying to do that through different questions. So, a couple points that I think are relevant from this. One is that it's changing quickly, and 2 is that you might not get a renewal. So even if you've had cyber insurance for a long time, the insurance industry, they're doing a lot of different things, and we're going to talk about that some, but you might not get a renewal, or you might not get a policy if you haven't had one in the past, if you're not doing the right things internally, or if you don't have the right risk posture or security posture. And I think that's really what's important to understand about insurance today. We did a survey, Frank, of some companies, and asked a couple of questions, which I think are really revealing and typical, quite honestly, of the industry. Has your organization ever been provided a security ratings report as part of qualifying for a cyber insurance policy? That's what do you think about these results? Does anything jump out?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty telling, that both between the not sure or no, that really is the percentage that it is, because really it does indicate that either the information didn't make it to the team that has to ultimately manage the risk or be aware of those risks, or there's not an awareness, going even back to the prior slide, of what is in that cyber insurance policy, and how that even aligns to the potentially the requirements that or the risk that the organization has. and what should be covered as part of their business model.
Right. Yep. Yeah. For me, I think it's telling that like almost half of the respondents said yes. Right. So half the time insurance companies, people know that insurance companies are evaluating them and their risk. However they do that, right, which we're going to talk about a little bit. But the other revealing thing for me is the not sure, right? So what this tells me is that, people in the cyber group, they don't even know. They don't,
Right.
It's easy for me to say they don't even know. I get it. It's challenging. It can be challenging in an organization, but the cyber department should know from a treatment of risk standpoint, they should know if their cyber insurance companies are evaluating their risk.
Right.
They should know that.
How that report lines up to what they do or don't have in place.
Right. Second question, has your organization ever been provided a security ratings report by one of your customers or as part of a third-party risk assessment? What do you think about this one?
Yeah, and so for everyone on joining us today, this is becoming more and more common that there's people out there that are actually monitoring the state of their vendors and the whole, going back to the supply chain, there's too much risk out there for an entity to just blindly take a assessment that someone might have filled out and assume that that's the risk profile of the organization that they're doing business with. So it's becoming more common that these things are being utilized to understand that whole supply chain and third-party risk management types of requirements that many organizations have today. So the good news is that a high percentage have received those, but then the other piece of it is that either many haven't, and so they're either being monitored but don't even know it, and maybe even they're being excluded from doing business with an entity because they have a report or a risk rating that's not acceptable for that particular entity. So it cuts both ways.
Yep. I think it's important to understand that like the amount of data is just unbearable, right? It's unfathomable. It's more data than you can possibly as a human process, right? And so a lot of third parties or external parties, I'll call them, whether they're insurance providers, customers, whatever they are, they're automating a lot of this and they're using tools to evaluate your risk. And whatever it says is your risk, then they're making decisions based on that. So whether it's right, wrong, or indifferent, maybe they're having a conversation with people and those kind of things. But I think, it's important to understand that a lot of tools are being used today to make these decisions. So this slide has a lot of numbers on it. There's no question. And I think there's a couple key points that are worth pointing out. Do you want to go through this, Frank?
Sure. This is, as it notes at the bottom, this is an example of the way that one of the ratings services out there, security rating services, Security Scorecard, which is an ASMGI partner, rates or evaluates organizations as far as the criteria across the column, starting with application security and to the right. Similar to a credit rating agency, there's different categories that organizations are then assessed based on, the information from that hacker's eye view or outside in view of what, the risk profile looks like of an organization. A couple of things that are pretty interesting going back to the, even the question at the top, is the organization insurable? The cyber insurance providers use these types of services to determine, one, whether you are insurable or not, and second, what the policy or the premium should be that you would pay based on the risk profile of your organization based on this type of criteria. So that's where you could see that there's a range of grades that again, just like grades in school or exams, from A to F. A obviously being the best, F the worst. That based on this just sampling, you could see the distribution, and it's likely that for sure the D and Fs are not insurable, and potentially even the Cs and even the As or Bs, depending on whether there's low grades on some of the even other categories. And then the other point that's really important here is the followers column. You can see that across this just sampling of 50 organizations, how many organizations are following that 50 organizations. So it could be the cyber insurance provider is a follower of the entities that were sampled, or even the supply chain or the entities that are doing business with an entity are actively monitoring organizations for any changes in their risk rating to determine whether that's a signal of something that could potentially put their organization at risk.
Yep. I think it's important to note from this, there are 10 categories that are used to, there's a composite score that aggregates all 10 categories, and then an individual score per category. And if you're an A or a B or a C from a composite score, you're more likely to get cyber insurance. If you're a D or an F, you're not likely to get cyber insurance. Again, I wanted to talk about actual reports a little bit. And I think the other point that's worth making is that people are using this information either for you or against you, right? So the insurance companies, they're looking at this regularly, and they might show up as a follower by virtue of that. So are your clients using this data, right? So your clients are evaluating your risk. Maybe they have a third-party risk program, and they're evaluating you as part of that third-party risk program. But maybe they're just plain evaluating you and, doing some due diligence on different options that are available to them before they move forward. And whoever has the highest or the lowest risk score wins, right?
Right.
So the highest grade score in this case. But it's important to understand that externally people are using this information, and I think that's critical. So, it could be the insurance company, it could be your customers. It could also be the bad guys, right? What if they're using this and they're looking for trends and they're looking for transitions, and a new vulnerability shows up and you have it, and the bad guys are using this information and they see it show up, and then they're going to exploit it. They absolutely are going to exploit it. So this is I think really valuable information to have. And we have a special offer for the attendees on today's program. And I want to mention this, Frank, because I think it's important. If all these other external people are using this information, right, wouldn't it be good to know, what that information is?
Yeah,
so,
I mean, one way or another, this information is falling into the wrong hands, and it would be great if an organization understood what their risk profile was, so that you could proactively deal with these things. Right.
So if anybody on the webinar is an attendee, if you're interested in a report, we'll send one to you. Just let us know either in the QA box or send an email in and to Frank Yako, and we'll send you a report, and we'll also schedule us some time to go through the report and make sure that it's understandable and those kind of things, what's in it. But I want to make that offer known as well. Okay. So here's, cut to the chase, right? Here's what it's all about. So what are cyber risks in manufacturing? So I wanted to go through some of this and then talk about a risk model that can help address these things that show up. So the top 5 cyber risks in manufacturing: intellectual property theft. We know this is happening. And we know nation states generally attack, manufacturers for intellectual property, quite honestly. So the theft of intellectual property is very high. Phishing is still a very high cyber risk. OT and IoT attacks, the surface, in my opinion, this is the way I view OT. OT has been around forever, right? And it's likely always been an attack surface, but you can't get to the business information. Theoretically, the concept in the industry is an air gap, right? So it's been separated from the IT network. Now with IT-OT convergence, what it means is a lot of OT devices, and with the proliferation of IoT devices or industrial IoT devices, they're being connected to the business network. So these need to be addressed from an attack surface standpoint for sure. Supply chain attacks, we see this happening a lot, right? So the bad guys going after a service provider or a software provider that a ton of customers use, and implanting a vulnerability in that. Ransomware is still on the list, and ransomware is very unfortunate, quite honestly. But if you do the right things from a risk standpoint, we know that we can reduce or help companies reduce their their risk and exposure. Attack surface reduction. I put this as a separate line item because we're going to talk specifically about it, third-party risk. Compliance is a huge area. It's very dynamic and it's very much changing in manufacturing, right? So, compliance requirements like CMMC and NIST 871, anybody who does business with the federal government has got to meet a certain baseline, security posture, and the government's getting very serious about that. Executive orders, there are a lot of executive orders that are coming down, but 14078 we know apply specifically, software bill of materials, zero trust, things like that are really happening. And there are a lot of regulations, right? So ITAR, it's been around for a long time, but anybody who does business with the DoD is not just going to have to meet ITAR, and their requirements are changing, right? So but IATF, this is this is something that we've come across oftentimes. But any manufacturer who sells to the auto industry, they do a quality audit. The auto industry does a quality audit, and they're incorporating these concepts of cyber into that. So all of these things are going to influence each other, right? And incident response is on the list because having an incident response plan and practicing and doing tabletops and doing all those things and really knowing how to address an incident when it shows up, I think is critically important. And and it made the list because we see a lot of companies, especially in manufacturing, who don't have an incident response plan, right? So some of the larger companies do. So anything you would add to this list, Frank?
And not so much add, but just tying back to the conversation on the monitoring piece. If as an example, someone was coming in and doing an audit, they would run a risk rating report and then use that to even zero in on items that an organization might have claimed they are addressed or have addressed as part of their compliance program, but then are just not, doing those things, and just becomes that much more of an item that they have to justify why they might have, communicated a certain status, and then that's not being supported by the risk rating report or services.
Yep. Cool. I wanted to talk about attack surface reduction a little bit because I think it's very popular in the industry right now. And, theoretically, at least, if you reduce the attack surface, you're going to reduce the number of places that the bad guys can penetrate, right? Or compromise your network and those kind of things. So one of the big things in attack surface reduction is understanding and knowing what assets you have. And this can be really, really challenging, but maybe you can reflect a little bit, Frank, on the discovery piece, like understanding the assets.
Yeah, so I know we have a number of different types of examples of under that category, but really it all comes down to you can't manage or address vulnerabilities unless you have an understanding of what that attack surface is and the level of granularity that's required because of the proliferation of IoT, OT, IIoT devices. Is just expanding that by the day, minute, and with all the integrations out there, it just further highlights the vulnerabilities that might exist within a device that would then compromise or pose a risk to an organization. So the whole process of doing that, there's all types of tools out there that an organization can leverage, and it might vary depending on the types of discovery process you need to go through. But again, it's one of those things where you have to go through and do that so that and going back to even the equation that we originally posed, if you don't know something exists, then you can't decrease or reduce the likelihood of that and the impact that would have if it's just something you don't have visibility on.
Right. Yep. And I think that quote is really, it really cuts to the chase, right? If you don't know about it, you can't protect against, bad things. I think that becomes, so we'll help by identifying, 4 areas that make it challenging to do asset discovery, right? So aggregating the asset data from many sources. So there's a lot of data being generated. Just the quantity of data and the format of that data is challenging. It creates a lot of challenges in creating an asset. like what format are you going to put it in? You've got all these different inputs, right? And they all come from, so how are you going to normalize all this data if it's all different and those kind of things? Finding unmanaged devices. So OT falls into this category, right? It's an unmanaged device in that there's no security agent on it. You're not doing vulnerability scans, internal vulnerability scans, and all those other things, right? So, manufacturing has a tremendous amount of what are referred to as unmanaged devices. So how do you create an inventory of those? Real-time inventorying at a large scale. I mean, it's daunting. It can be very daunting, like virtual reality and manufacturing 4.0. So there's a lot of transformation happening in this industry. There's a lot of transformation happening in all industries, quite honestly, right? But in manufacturing 4.0 is a big thing. And so a lot of people are using artificial intelligence and machine learning and sources of data, right? So the IoT and OT and IoT and industrial IoT are popping up all over the place. So real-time inventorying that data, it's daunting, and testing and compliance can be challenging as well. So I just wanted to talk about that, and then I want to drill down into the OT security, because this is a huge attack surface area, quite honestly, and most OT devices are now connected to the business network, right? So most people think of Colonial Pipeline as an OT type device because it's a pipeline company, right? Or an OT type attack because it's a pipeline company. It wasn't an OT attack. It was an IT attack, right? They shut the OT network down because they couldn't bill for the gasoline that was going to the East Coast. It was attack on the IT network, not on the OT network. So what I personally view OT is an increased attack surface, and people will exploit vulnerabilities on the OT network to get to, not that they couldn't create harm and on the OT network. They could blow things up or wreak havoc, right, from an OT network standpoint. But I think primarily they want to get to the IT network. So I want to talk a little bit about OT and IoT and IIoT. And I thought I'd start with a little riddle, Frank. So put your riddle cap on.
You set me up here.
So a famous philosopher once asked this question, right? If a black box is opened in a forest and no one's around to look inside the box, are there vulnerabilities in it or not?
Well, only because of the world that we live in and how cynical I've become as as we're more aware of what's going on, I would say yes. There's a
I think it's really indicative. It's indicative of a problem in the industry, right? So there are black boxes all over the place, and nobody's looking inside the box, right? They're looking outside the box for vulnerabilities, and there are a lot of vulnerabilities that exist inside the box. And so that we actually took an OT device and looked from the outside in. So most enterprise grade commercially available scanners, most if not all, I should say, probably all, right? They do an outside in scan. So they're not looking in the box. They're scanning for vulnerabilities that they can see, right? So, and we talk about creating an asset inventory of OT devices. Is probably the same tool that's creating the asset inventory that's looking for the vulnerabilities, but they're only able to look at the network traffic or scan from the outside in. 5 vulnerabilities. So we took an actual OT device and scanned it with an actual enterprise grade commercially available scanner, found 5 vulnerabilities. That's great. That's not bad, right? 5 vulnerabilities. You found one of them's critical. If you fix that vulnerability, I would say that's very good, right? If you find that vulnerability, that's very good. But, I put this in the box of you don't know what you don't know. So there's another way to look for vulnerabilities on this device. And that is to, search the national databases of CVEs, right? So you look for on the national database. NIST has a national database of CVEs, right? So it's easy and publicly accessible. You can search that database for specific devices and or specific vulnerabilities, blah, blah, blah. found 2 vulnerabilities. So searched the national database of CVEs and found 2 vulnerabilities. They weren't the same as the 5 vulnerabilities, right? But in any event, found 2 vulnerabilities. So there you go. So the other option is to look in the box, right? To actually open
Yeah,
the
I was
box.
right. I was right.
You were right. 142 vulnerabilities. There's a huge difference. So we have the ability, and I want to make sure everybody understands this. It's not because you're negligent that you're not finding these vulnerabilities. It's because you're not looking for them, right? You don't know what you don't know. And most companies fall into this category. Most companies are putting an enterprise grade scanner in and saying, hey, we got 5 vulnerabilities. Let's go fix them, right? And even if they get fixed, that's 5 vulnerabilities, 142 vulnerabilities. So this is important to understand. There are a lot of vulnerabilities that exist. They're not all exploitable, right? Some of them aren't exploitable. So the risk may be very low from a risk standpoint. So the likelihood that they're going to get exploited could be very low, right? The impact could be very high, but if the likelihood is very low, it's still a manageable risk from that perspective. But here's the thing that I think is the point that's worth making. What if the bad guys find out that those vulnerabilities exist? What if the bad guys exploit a vulnerability that you don't even know about? That's like, how do you protect against something you don't even know about? So I think there's a critical component there. So, and then the other point that I would make is, this is just the vulnerabilities. So we have a tool that will look inside the box to identify vulnerabilities, but it also has a lot of connectors and options that you can identify information. If you look at all, the Linux kernel, and you look at all these different places for different things that create risk. And there are a lot of other things that you can find besides just vulnerabilities, right? So, but I think it's critical to understand that. So,
hey, Steve, one quick item. We did receive a question asking to define what OT is, or operational technology.
Yep.
So if you just give a quick example of that.
Yep. So a pressure transmitter, for example. So an OT device could exist or a vibration analyzer. So all rotating equipment, or most rotating equipment, has vibration analyzers on the legs, right? And so if you put vibration analyzers around there, they send data back, or IO points. Maybe this will date me a little bit, but when I used to work in process control, Frank, and when I worked in process control, I started in 1988, but the vibration analyzers already existed, and steam turbines, they all had vibration analyzers on. And so, that data would go back to a central distributed control system, or a programmable logic controller, or whatever. But that vibration analyzer was an OT device, operational technology. So, today, we think of IoT devices, and they're prolific, right? So anything that creates data is generally classified as an IoT device. But operational technology has been around for a long, long time in manufacturing, both discrete and continuous processes like chemical plants and refineries and those kind of things. So I hope that helps. Would a PLC fall under OT or IoT? A PLC would fall under OT. That would be operational technology. But the thing that I think is important to note is, back in the day, all of the distributed control systems, the DCS systems or the PLCs, they had a proprietary, operating system and those kind of things. And all of the field devices, the OT devices, were hardwired back to the controllers. And so, like, I used to work at a steel mill, and we put in a Bailey Net 90. Bailey doesn't exist anymore. Neither does the Net 90, quite honestly. But in any event, all of the field sensors were hardwired back to the controller, and it had a proprietary operating system. Today, most systems run on Windows-based servers, quite honestly, right? So there's this whole thing about keeping the OS patched and relevant and up to date and those kind of things. building management systems and security monitoring systems, IoT devices. Building management generally falls under the IoT device. Now, it can get a little bit convoluted sometimes when you talk about, you know, HVAC and a lot of the water treatment facilities that are within buildings, and, you know, the water plants, I'll say, that are in buildings and those kind of things. It could be an OT device or an IoT device, but generally it's IoT. All right, so compliance is a huge challenge because it's changing constantly, right? And today we see a lot of compliance in manufacturing changing a lot, quite honestly. And I just wanted to make the point and call out that this is real, right? So a big component of managing risk is making sure that you're compliant, because if you're not compliant with particularly federal government regulations, that's not a good thing, right? So you're going to lose revenue as a result of that. And so being compliant with those requirements is paramount. And so that should be a part of any cyber program, right? But CMMC, we know has gone through a bunch of changes, right? So there used to be, well, there's still 5 levels, right? But there used to be some differences in the way that you evaluated what level you needed to be in and what compliance requirements you had, and what's the relationship between CMMC and NIST 800-171, you know, and DFARS and all of these things. So just how all of those pieces fit together, it's critically important that you stay up with those things. Executive orders. So this is another area from a regulation standpoint we see a lot of, right? And recently there have been a lot of executive orders, probably because of the rise in ransomware and, you know, the criticality of ransomware and cyber attacks in general, and the fact that our critical infrastructure as a nation is low, right? Is weak. And so, you know, we saw a water plant in Florida get infiltrated, and the bad guys, you know, changed the concentration of a mixture that went into the water. So there are a lot of bad things that could happen as a result of this. And I just wanted to call that out, because compliance requirements is a critical component of this. And the other thing I wanted to mention as it relates to compliance is that executive orders are numerous and important to consider. And so EO Executive Order 14028 specifically is for anyone who does business with the government. But, you know, NIST is adopting a lot of these practices and principles into their framework. And we think it's going to, you know, apply to many other businesses. But we did a webinar recently on Executive Order 14028 specifically. We had Rockwell and Cleveland Clinic as participants in this webinar, and the insights were phenomenal, right? But there were a couple critical things that really came out of this executive order. One was the software bill of materials. I think this is important to understand. The software bill of materials, it has to apply to firmware as well as, you know, the cloud app or the SaaS app that collects all this data, right? Where things are viewed on a dashboard or various different things. There is software actually that lives on the device, and it's critically important to understand that and decompose that and evaluate that from a vulnerability standpoint. But the other thing that came out of this was zero trust. Was mentioned a lot in this executive order, is creating a zero trust network. So there were a lot of things specific to this. I think this specific executive order came down on May 21st of 2021, and there, you know, the time frame was 12 months to implement a lot of these things. Any comments, Frank?
Yeah, I think, you know, between the items you were talking about as far as the regulations and from a compliance standpoint, you know, the good news is that, you know, a lot of industries, as well as obviously the government as well, are defining these requirements so that there is some, you know, consistent, if you want to call it a source of reference for, you know, meeting the different security requirements. So it becomes something, one is, you know, something that you can reference and understand, but at the same time, you know, there's a reason why these are being enacted, because a lot of organizations are not keeping up with, you know, the security requirements that are required to be either part of a supply chain or even to do business with the government. So, the important point on all that is that it's, understand what the requirements are for the industry segment that you're in, what is applicable to you, and then, what you have to do to get compliant with those, because sooner or later, someone's going to come knocking, whether it's an auditor or someone that you do business with, a customer that is required upstream from you to actually comply with those as well. So that's something just to, again, they continue to evolve because of the threat landscape continues to evolve, but that's all only to help ultimately the whole ecosystem to continue to be more secure and reduce risk.
Yep. One of the other things, Frank, I think that's worth noting is auditors. I heard you mention the audit, and it really triggered this thought, but auditors used to ask the question like this: do you do something like disaster recovery, or do you do it? And yes or no, right? Check a box. But now auditors are saying, show me evidence that you do it, not just once, right? Forever, continuously, right? So there are sample sets being asked for in these audits that really, I'll say, guarantee that you're not just doing it once, that you do it all the time. And I think that's a critical differentiator. So third-party risk, I wanted to mention this because I think it's such a critical area of risk, right? Our third parties, we all have them. We all have third parties, and we probably are a third party to other, like whoever buys our product or service, we're a third party to them. But we all have third parties as well. So we have to evaluate the risk that our third parties introduce to our business. And then, our customers are evaluating us based on the third party risk that we introduce into their environment and those kind of things. And both of those are really moving up the stack from a value standpoint. And I think it's important to really solidify a third party risk program. And, we know that a lot of the data breaches that are occurring and a lot of the compromises of network that are occurring as a result of a third party, right? Like Target, Target being the most probably popular public example of this, but, an HVAC vendor of Target was the reason they got compromised, right? So, I get it. That's an example. There are third parties. We see software supply chain as a risk. That's a third party risk, right? We see. So I think evaluating your third parties becomes critically important, and having a structured program to do that is more important than ever. Any comments on that, Frank?
Yeah, and this I'm sure we're not getting into all the detail about all these different categories, but it just shows how many variables there are in doing business with an entity, and the different factors that could impact whether you would be considered to do business with potential customer based on all the different criteria that are listed here. So it's becoming more and more complex is really the bottom line.
Yeah, and I think, like a lot of companies that we've interacted with, they have a feeling that their program is very mature, and they have a structure and a methodology for evaluating third-party risk. And a lot of them are using spreadsheets to do that, right? So again, I think this a lot of times falls into the bucket of automation is critically important, and having a tool to assist you in doing third-party risk and evaluating. Let's face it, like more often today than certainly than a decade ago, but probably even a year ago, more often today we're leveraging SaaS applications, or we're leveraging third parties to house critical data or do critical things to our business. And if they're disrupted in any way, supply chain, COVID really introduced this regional nature, or the risk that's introduced by geography and those kind of things, concentration risk. Basically, it really introduced this as a topic that's critically important to understand, how that impacts your business. But I think, leveraging a tool to do third-party risk is more important today than it was yesterday, and it'll probably be more important yet tomorrow. So I wanted to talk a little bit about a risk management model that we know works. And the reason we know it works is because this is the way we structure risk management at ASMGI and for our customers and everything, but risk management equals the risk assessment. So a lot of things start with an assessment, just evaluate where you want to be, where you are today, and, prioritize the initiatives and those kind of things. But start with a risk assessment, do the risk mitigation. And I can't emphasize how important it is to have a structured incident response plan, because, the consensus in the industry is it's not if, but when, right? Not if you get breached, but when you get breached, those kind of things. So I think it's important to really talk through those topics and emphasize the importance of practice, like we always say. From a risk, we showed what the 4 possible treatments of risk were. This model is we're only going to talk about how do you reduce your risk. And that's really all we're going to talk about. So the first component of this is the assessment piece. So maybe you can take us through this, Frank.
Sure. So we really break it down by, the number of categories. One is the cyber risk. So that really is the thing that we were talking about as far as the risk rating, understanding your risk profile, and then having some way of capturing, how the things that you are aware of are perceived from the outside. And that's that hacker eye view that we talked about from a security or risk ratings perspective. The other is on the technology front. We've talked, about the asset, knowing the assets, but then it really goes down, beyond that is having some type of active monitoring, because in today's day and age, if you don't have visibility real time on the environment that you're responsible for, then you just have too many blind spots to even be able to react to those things. And then ultimately, and we talked about this, was the vulnerability management and remediation. So that whole risk management piece, having that visibility, getting to the point where you understand what the vulnerabilities are within your environment, and then having an actual program. And that goes well beyond just doing patching. So that's something, that's for another discussion, but it's just, part of the process of dealing with those things. And then, going through and doing, once you understand what those vulnerabilities are and start remediating those, then really going through and dealing with, how you plan that, how do you approach dealing with all the things that might have to happen ultimately to do the remediation of those vulnerabilities, and on an ongoing basis.
Yep. I would make the point from the outside in, we call it the hacker's eye view, but it's not just the hackers that are viewing this data, right? Insurance companies we know are using this data regularly, and so are third parties, right? So are your customers likely using this data. So these things that you talk about, they also apply to applications and end users, correct?
Yeah, exactly. And really, and we'll talk about this in a second, it's just the ability to standardize the model and how you think about each of these different components is important, because the more you can repeat the same activities, albeit a little bit different for each of those categories, it just helps to reinforce, just having some type of standard process and understanding how you have to deal with each of these. So same type of thing on the application front, whether it's, internal developed applications, off-the-shelf applications, SaaS, shadow IT, just having the view of what your organization uses to do business, and even more importantly, where data resides. And then having some way to monitor, the use of those, as well as whether, what your cloud or your security posture is related to all those different solutions. And then ultimately, again, same type of thing, having an active vulnerability management and remediation process to actively go and manage those. It's not just a once and done when you go and implement a solution, it's on an ongoing basis. And then same kind of concept on the end user front. Understanding what your risk profile is from an end user perspective by doing an assessment, benchmarking where you're at as far as your users' awareness of cybersecurity, good, hygiene, and then ultimately going through and doing the training, and then validating that on an ongoing basis, which is again equivalent to the vulnerability management and remediation for some of the other categories.
Yeah. So I want to get into the mitigation piece a little bit. Attack vector analysis. So it's critically important to understand, but there's a difference between attack surface and attack vector, right? Attack surface is what the bad guys are going to attack, and attack vector is how they're going to do the attack. And so how do we do attack vector analysis? Just give us, if you can just give us a summary, Frank, because we are running.
Yeah, it's really, this is really a good formula. Again, we'll obviously provide these slides for everyone, but really kind of following this flow from end to end is really what we recommend, and that all ties into understanding and tying back what those even to the point of the business impact assessment, how you treat the different vulnerabilities and risks that you have, and then getting to the point where you incorporate that into the incident response plans that you have, because all vulnerabilities or attack vectors are not potentially the same impact on your organization, and then incorporate that into ultimately your tabletop exercises. So again, more than happy to do a deep dive on this if anyone's interested from a follow-up conversation. But it really is these steps that are critical for that overall process.
Yep. I like this table approach because it really breaks it down into activities that you can do, but we categorize, where these activities become important. But I heard you say before, and I think a critical part to, really deploying a program to, help lower your risk is try to do the same things, for different categories of events. So maybe you can talk through what this table means and how it's structured.
So on the left side, we have those different activities that we were just describing. So it's that sort of muscle memory, building that muscle memory, following these steps, really across then each of the different categories that we've been talking about, and one, not omitting anything, because you could not do this for one of those columns and then, still, have a high risk, because you might do two out of the four, but then it still leaves your organization at risk. But the bottom line is, again, this is kind of a cookbook, if you look at it that way, for performing these various activities across all those different categories. And again, applying that on a consistent basis to how you manage the risk of your organization. And again, we're more than happy to talk about the details of how on any of these particular categories, if anyone's interested in follow-up discussions.
Yep. And then lastly, I want to go through the incident response program a little bit. And we won't spend a lot of time trying to define what incident response is. I know, most people realize if you have an incident, you have to have a structured way to respond to it. What I want to talk about specifically is, like, how do we do incident response and what do we base it on, Frank? Do you want to talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, it all goes back to the, sort of that life cycle approach. So, the top of this diagram shows the things that you should be doing pre-incident, during incident, post-incident, and then breaks down those, those steps in further detail. But, one of the things that we definitely follow is the NIST 800-61, that becomes a common language for both how to operate within your organization, as well as dealing with, business partners or third parties that you might do business with. And we really recommend rallying around a framework. It doesn't have to be this one, but this is becoming more and more common. And again, this becomes that method for one, following something that's very structured and also is very well defined and becoming very well known across many different industries and facets of the world. So again, bottom line is, there's that full life cycle, which again, can be very prescriptive as far as the steps that you have to take, and there's some great information out there available for that as well.
Yep. And I think the key point is that, leverage a framework for doing incident response, because it creates a common language in your organization. It also gives you that structure, step 1, step 2, step 3. And we have a slide. I'm going to move past this, Frank. But we can talk about, or we can show everybody on the webinar, like how to implement a program and those kind of things. And I think that's critically important. For the different categories of incidents, just, how do you address the standard, the 800-161 categories of preparation, detection, and containment and post-incident response. But I want to get to questions because I think it's important. We have several. So I have a question here, Frank, which I really think highlights this concept of IT/OT convergence. So the question is, what about building management systems and security monitoring systems like doors and cameras and things like that, right? So my feedback to this would be the camera is an OT device. And the fact that cameras used to be on an isolated network of coaxial cable, right? And so they were completely isolated. So there was no opportunity to get to the business network or to gain access to other pieces of information, right? Today, most cameras have an Ethernet cable and they're connected to a switch, to an Ethernet switch with all other kinds of data and those kind of things. So the camera itself is an OT device, which could be part of an attack surface, and there could be an attack vector where people leverage that attack surface to gain access to the business network or the IT network. So it's an OT device connected to the IT network, as is most OT and IoT and IIoT devices are connected in some way to the business network. So some other questions that we have. How does your risk model work for OT and IoT devices? And I'll let you reflect on this, Frank, but I would make the comment that, you know, this risk model is intended to apply to everything, right? So,
Right.
You know, go ahead and
yeah,
respond.
exactly. It's the point that we're trying to make across the whole presentation, that, you know, if you have a consistent model and method for going about this, it makes it a lot easier, and just, you know, not just, but it becomes a matter of understanding, you know, across those different activities that we outline, you know, how you go about doing that for the different categories of technology. And it really is a pretty thorough process if you follow that, you know, consistently.
Yep. I want to be respectful of everybody's time, so I'm going to try to fly through. We got a few questions remaining. How do I get a copy of the report? I assume this means the attacker's eye view or the outside in view, the security scorecard report that we referenced. Just let us know, send us an email, or, you know, type in the chat box or the QA box that you want a copy of the report, and we'll make sure you get that. So are you able to create an SBOM for software running on the device? And generally we would refer to the software that's running on the device as firmware. You know, it may be a device that actually has an operating system and, you know, leverages commercially available software, but it's probably firmware. So it's either running on a Linux kernel or a higher level language like C or C++. But in any event, we have a mechanism for identifying the vulnerabilities, and the way that you create a software bill of material, we have some tools that will analyze the software that's used to build the firmware and build a structured software bill of materials from that. So yes, that's possible, and we have a mechanism for, you know, for delivering that type of functionality. Many transformational ideas bring data from several IoT devices back to a central application. How do you create an SBOM for this model? This is a great question. Because there are two types of interacting things, right? So there's the device, the IoT device, or the OT device, or IIoT device, which is creating data, and it has software. And so the SBOM for that device, you have to evaluate the software that's in the firmware on that device. And so we have a mechanism for doing that. If there are multiple devices that are shipping data back to a central location, and there's probably a SaaS app or a cloud app that's running, that's creating dashboards and various different views of all that data. So we have mechanisms, both static code analysis and SCA views of that software to create a software bill of materials from that. Anything to add to that, Frank, before we wrap up?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good example where just understanding all the different components and that are interacting, as well as could then be potentially items that you'd want to have that type of information about.
Yep. Closing remarks, Frank. So, and we'll let everyone.
Yeah, I think just going back to the original question about, is this possible to manage and assess risks in an environment or organizational risk? I the answer is absolutely. It has to be very prescriptive. And again, just, repeat what we said, that, following some type of methodology, doing it consistently, and having that holistic view is extremely important.
Got it. Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you everyone for attending and sharing your time with us today. And thanks for all the questions. I really appreciate that. Have a great day. Thanks.
Yep.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.